Welcome to the Politics Guys, a place for a bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Michael Baranowski, a political scientist at Northern Kentucky University. With me today is my regular co-host, Cleveland area attorney and Republican factotum, Jay Carson.
Good morning, Mike.
How you doing, Jay?
Well, we had some technical issues this morning, but aside from that, I'm pretty good.
Yeah, I'm feeling a little tired, and I wonder if it's just because we had such a crazy week politically. So why don't we just sort of get right into it?
Yeah.
So we obviously are going to lead off with the furor over thousands of family separations resulting from the Trump administration's zero-tolerance illegal immigration policy, which was announced at the beginning of April by Attorney General Jeff Sessions. Now, there's an awful lot to cover here, so I'm just going to try my best to hit all the major elements, and when I'm done, Jay, let me know if there's anything I missed.
I will interrupt as needed.
Okay. So there was a massive outcry over family separations at the border this week, with both Democrats and Republicans calling for the policy to stop. Now, the White House put out a variety of messages, but to me, the main one was that they were simply enforcing the law and that the administration's hands were tied absent Congress acting to change the law. Now, there was strong bipartisan pushback on this because both the Obama and the Bush administrations, working under the same laws, didn't separate families. And critics pointed out that they could do this through their perfectly acceptable use of prosecutorial discretion, and that it really was a policy change by the Trump administration, that zero-tolerance policy, that was responsible or at fault. Now, most polling shows the public strongly opposed to family separation, though there was at least one poll where a small minority of Republicans supported the administration's position. But throughout the week, as the pressure ratcheted up, President Trump finally, I hate to use the word capitulated, but we'll use it, capitulated and signed an executive order
Made a deal.
Yeah, there you go. Ending the family separations, despite the fact that only a few days earlier he said that he couldn't do anything. Now, under the order, parents will still be prosecuted or can still be prosecuted, but their children will be kept in custody with them. Now, as things stand, this then creates a potential conflict with the 1997 Flores settlement, which has been interpreted by the courts to disallow detaining children for more than 20 days. And even though the administration plans to put family cases at the head of the line, if they can't reach a conclusion after 20 days, the parents would presumably have to be released with their children, which was more or less what the Obama and Bush administrations did.
Right. And also, what is colloquially referred to as catch and release.
Yeah, at least on the right. Now, I should also point out that there are reports.
There's some truth to that in that you just said. I mean, they are caught and then later, they're released.
Yeah, so I think the problem that some people on the left have with it, myself included, is it's sort of a dehumanizing sort of phrase. You use that for fish and things like that. But anyway, also I should point out that late in the week, the administration said that prosecutions of families will actually stop until adequate holding facilities can be constructed. Now, while all this is going on, the House Republicans have been working on an immigration bill that would address the family separation issue. But despite all the public pressure, negotiations broke down. There's some talk of maybe a vote this coming week. We'll see. But Republican leaders chose to put the bill together within their caucus alone, without getting any Democratic input or anything like that, which means that it's almost certain not to pass in the Senate, where 9 Democratic votes would be needed. And President Trump himself pointed this out, saying that it was basically pointless for the House to pass legislation and calling on voters to elect more Republicans in what he termed the red wave in 2018. So I think that brings us pretty much up to date as of today, Saturday, the 23rd of June. Jay, are there any key points that I'm missing here?
I would add a couple things.
Okay.
First of all, I think there has been the media handling of this has been a little more than a little troubling. The little girl who sort of became the face of this issue of the parent separation issue turns out to have not been separated from her parents. at all ever. Yet the media continues to run with that picture. Time magazine, in fact, putting it on its cover despite knowing that this girl who was crying was not separated from her parents. So that's one thing. The other piece of this that again, I think this isn't so much the policy part of it. This is the politics and just how it's been spun. I think there's been a massive overreaction on the left, saying that this is tantamount to what happened in the Japanese internment. Others comparing this to concentration camps in Auschwitz. And to that extent, I mean that's so far over the top. And I think what you pointed out is we are really in sort of a catch-22 situation. There are laws on the books that say it is illegal to cross illegally into the U.S. Now, again, there is a manner if you go to a recognized border crossing station, show up and say, "Hi, I'm here. I want asylum." There is a different process than if you try to cross somewhere outside and are apprehended. That said, I mean that process isn't great either. You are but there's not the incarceration issue that goes with and the family separation piece that flows from it. But look, I mean, I don't know that there's any way out of this other than Congress to change the law. If we're going to say that we're actually going to enforce, and prevent illegal crossings or prosecute them.
Well, let me ask you about that, because as I said, under not just the Obama administration, but the Bush administration, the same laws were on the books. And I mean, I don't know
chose
that
not to enforce them. Yeah.
Well, yeah, that's one way to say it. But it's also, true that in any aspect of law, the idea that every single person who commits a crime will be prosecuted is just something that doesn't happen. I mean, that's where prosecutorial discretion comes in. And so the idea that the Trump administration just simply there's nothing they could do. That's simply not the case. That's wrong.
No, you're correct. You're correct there. No, I think that's right. For him to say that there's no such thing as prosecutorial discretion. Now, there is, I think, the issue, and we talked about this a while back during the Obama administration on the Dreamers. There's one thing to say there's prosecutorial discretion, and there is another to say, I am simply not going to enforce this law. Prosecutorial discretion is more typically a case-by-case basis, saying, look, the prosecutor doesn't want to bring this case because, well, it's not super strong. There's likelihood we might win or we might lose, or whatever. The resources that would be put into this prosecution versus the public interest in having this person prosecuted, there's no match there. And that's, for example, on say a lot of illegal immigration questions. Look, how much good is being done by prosecuting, a particular illegal immigrant, versus the resources expended. But I think there's a problem, and it's not a small problem in just saying prosecutorial discretion. We're not going to enforce this act. And the reason we're not going to do it, well, because it's sort of inconvenient.
But that's not really what we're saying. And I would object to the term inconvenient. I would say that the family separation thing is more than that. It's inhumane. But
no. I mean the other way around. I mean, not that saying that we're not going to prosecute because it's going to be tremendous amount of resources that we would have to commit to it.
Sure, but I mean that's part of it. Is if you don't have the resources to prosecute everyone, you have to make decisions, and that's the other part of this that I wanted to point out. Regardless of how you feel about zero tolerance as a policy, and I should point out that I think it's a horrible policy for a lot of reasons. I think it's un-American. I think it's un-Christian. All that kind of stuff, but I will admit that there are people who advance this policy who are well-meaning, non-racist sort of people who believe it's the right thing to do. That said, the way this was rolled out was yet another example of Trump administration administrative incompetence. And let me explain what I mean by this. So Jeff Sessions announces this at the beginning of April. Well, number one, you don't roll out a policy unless you have the infrastructure in place to take care of it. And clearly, the administration didn't have the infrastructure in place. I mean, right now they're saying, well, we're hurriedly constructing facilities to try to deal with this. The time to do that is actually before you announce the policy. You have everything ready to go. You say, we have these facilities, we can make up more than, the people that are coming in, and it's set to go, and then you announce the policy. They did this backwards, and this is not just an isolated incident. This is yet another example of just an incredibly administratively incompetent administration. And my guess is that it relates to, more than anything else, just a great impatience, starting from the president, who sees these immigration numbers and says, we need to do something now. And that's exactly the wrong way to go about. I mean, comparatively speaking, this makes the Obamacare rollout look like a massive success. So this to me is certainly a questionable policy, one I disagree with, but also one that was rolled out in an incredibly incompetent way.
No, I have to agree with you on that. I think the better way to have done this would have been, look, this should have been starting back during the campaign. You should have had your immigration policy people thinking, okay, here's what we'll do if we're going to say we are actually going to enforce our laws as far as then okay, here's what the policy is going to be. We're aware of the Flores settlement situation. Here's what we have to do to comply with that, and take those steps there.
Exactly. Yeah.
Now again, but I want to point out sort of the difficulty that we have here. If the plan is, listen, if someone is apprehended, and look, on illegal border crossing, in most cases, without assuming there's no aggravating circumstances, trafficking, that kind of stuff, it's a misdemeanor. It is sort of like getting the speeding ticket. That sort of thing. It is, or whatever, a public intoxication. It is a typically not something that one is jailed for. Perhaps, but the nature of this problem is something different than a speeding ticket, where you can get your ticket and they say, all right, here you go. If you want to contest this, show up in court next month.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, because I think that's a really important point. And one thing on that I wanted to point out is that there are these things called alternatives to detention. Ankle monitors is probably the most commonly known one. And a couple of things about that. Obviously, most people would say that's far more humane than detaining people for misdemeanors. It's also, I'm sure it comes as no surprise, far less expensive. But not only that, according to a recent ICE report, well over 90% of the people who are detained using these, using these alternatives to detention, show up for their hearings. So this, to me, it certainly doesn't seem as tough, we're releasing them into the country to do whatever nefarious things they'll do, which is generally
no.
nothing.
And I wouldn't even argue do whatever nefarious things.
Well,
the problem is, but there being people released into the country, and this is how we sort of arrived at the immigration problem we have now, where there are millions of people here because they came in. And perhaps didn't show up for hearing, didn't show up to get a visa renewed for whatever. And now we're in a situation of, well, what do we do with them? We can't deport them all. And so.
But if well over 90% show up, and I think the figure I saw was, I want to say 96 point something from this report, then that's not really the issue here. You could say, well, it should be 100%, and 100% would show up if they're detained. But there's a cost benefit type of analysis you run here, not just for cost, but also for how humane it is, or if you don't want to look at it that way, the optics of it. And so the question, if alternatives to detention are that effective, that much more humane, and that much less expensive, then the question really isn't, the concern really isn't so much that, a lot of people aren't showing up for that. The concern is what happens after that hearing. That's a different problem.
Right. Well, but here's the other thing, though, and I agree with you. We might tussle on the expense. That's something I'd have to look up when you're talking about these sort of massive, significant numbers, and who pays for the monitoring and the ankle bracelets and all that. I mean, it's one thing for a local community to have, say, whatever, a couple thousand people on monitoring. It's something else to say when you have the number's 50,000 a month in this latest couple waves. That's just a different.
Well, and also should point out that not everyone who crosses the border illegally, it wouldn't be a case where you just throw an ankle monitor on them and let them go. I mean, it depends on the individual circumstances.
Sure.
So I mean, this is the kind of thing where, for instance, in instances where those people who are crossing with their families, that might be a first option for them, as opposed to your other folks and so forth.
Right.
So
well, the other thing I was going to point out, though, even with those, there still has to be some sort of initial detention and, for lack of a better word, arraignment, I guess. So
sure, for evaluation and that kind of thing. Absolutely.
So I mean, and when you have this many people. It's not like you just sort of stop at the border and okay, here's your monitor. See you later.
Sure.
There is necessarily a piece of you're being held until you can see a judge, magistrate, whatever, to be charged, and then they give you your court date and say, okay, here's your ankle monitor. Come back. And that's a lot of what we're talking about. And the Trump administration has made this point, and I think to pretty credibly. These separations are not permanent separations. They are in many cases. I mean, the way it's supposed to work is the parent is taken to court to be charged, and then there is a initial separation time after which they're reunited. Yeah. Now that's the way it's supposed to work in theory, and I understand there are stories out there that that's not how it's always working in practice.
But it's problematic even in theory, even if it's a short separation, because there's a wealth of information and research demonstrating that, especially for very young children, that sort of separation, even if it's for a week or 2 weeks, can be incredibly psychologically damaging to these kids.
Well, my understanding, though, is the procedure, it's supposed to be like a 24 to 48 hours.
Well, I mean, yeah,
separation. But
even
no,
then,
again, and I won't argue that's not traumatic either. But I think the media has spun this again into this idea of internment camps and concentration camps, and I think that's unconscionable.
Sure, there are some people who are focusing on isolated incidents, the worst of the worst, and not trying to paint a fair and complete picture. Absolutely, that happens.
Oh, no. I mean, I'm going to push back a little bit. There was Jay Winnick, the historian, had a piece in the Wall Street Journal last week, and Winnick, I've read some of his books. I have no idea what his ideological background is. But no, I mean, even if you say the worst of the worst situations, this case is nowhere close to a concentration camp. And he made that point really in pretty shocking, startling terms.
Well, sure.
I think this is, I usually don't like that. Hey, we got to push back and say, hey, this is beyond the pale. But I think in this case, some of the things comparing what we're talking about now to Auschwitz.
Well, sure, of course. But the responsible mainstream media isn't doing that. I mean, I know because I know that there are voices on the left who are saying that, just like there are crazy voices on the right in any given issue. But the fact of the matter is if you get your news from a basic middle of the road kind of mainstream outlet like the New York Times or the Washington Post, you're not seeing these crazy comparisons to Auschwitz.
Well, no, but nor are you seeing any disclaiming that either.
Well,
I mean, I think that's
sure. Well, I guess they could start their articles by saying, "Well, this isn't like Auschwitz," but I mean, there are. If we spend all of our time,
there are the voices that say, "Oh, this is beyond the pale. And in some cases, I think those outlets have had op-ed pieces, if not the Nazi comparison, then certainly the Japanese internment comparison, which again is
that's a different comparison, and I think it's a little more apt.
Well, I would disagree with you.
But at least it's not beyond the pale. It's not like we're bringing Nazis into this.
No, I agree. Okay, I would agree with that. It's not beyond the pale. I think it's a bad comparison.
Okay, fair enough. The other thing I wanted to ask you about is you mentioned the image of the little girl who wasn't actually separated from her parents. Then there was this other thing that came up where Melania Trump went to visit that center in Texas and was wearing a jacket that said, "I really don't care, do you?" Right. Now, it seems to me that now the President Trump tweeted that, well, she's talking about the media and so forth. But I would say that once again, I'm not going to try to figure out what any Trump's motives are here. Okay, I'm going to put that aside. But once again, I would say it's a failure of competence, because I find it hard to believe that a former model, someone who is very conscious her whole life about her clothing and appearance and that, doesn't take care with what she wears. So I don't know what message she was intending to send, but for the most part, people who wear jackets that have huge letters, words, phrases on the back know that that's going to convey a message. And if that person happens to be the First Lady of the United States of America, they know even more. So even if by some bizarre happenstance she didn't realize that, I don't know, maybe she was in a fugue state.
It was early morning, trying to run to catch the plane. She grabs the jacket out of the closet. Yeah.
But of course she has staff. and responsible, competent staff would say, whoa, no, I don't know what you're going for with this jacket, but this is probably not the jacket to wear here. Maybe you wear it when you're being interviewed by, a media outlet or something like that, but not here, because this could be misconstrued even if you don't mean this. So again, I certainly understand why people came to the conclusion that she's sending a very kind of, FU message. But even that aside, it certainly is a failure of competence.
Look, it's hard to disagree with you there. Again, I would expect that she's got plenty of other jackets.
Yeah, I think so.
I mean, it's the only sort of rational explanation that I come up with. I don't know that anyone's made this. Would be she wanted to do that just to sort of point out, you say I don't care, but look, here I am, and that kind of thing, sort of wearing it ironically. But that's those sort of messages. That doesn't work when you're First Lady.
No, ironic messages like that.
Again, it's sort of I mean, I don't know. I think back to Kurt Cobain appearing on Rolling Stone with the T-shirt that said, corporate magazines still suck or whatever.
Right.
So it's sort of, you can kind of get away with that
if you're Kurt Cobain,
when you're a rock star, but no, it is inexplicable really why she did that. Although, again, my point is on the image of the little girl. Look, if you're the media, that you are representing something that's not accurate. It is, as they say, fake news.
What is? I'm sorry.
Well, using this girl as the face of separations when there was no when she was not separated from her family. Particularly Time running this as their cover.
See, I understand what you're saying.
Flowering over her.
But to me, I guess, and maybe this shows my bias, I don't know, but to me, it doesn't matter really all that much if that particular girl was separated. I mean, to me, it's a illustration of what's going on.
But accurate.
What's that?
It is. That's sort of the Dan Rather response of fake but accurate.
But I mean, to me, it's like if someone drew a cartoon and you'd say, well, that cartoon character wasn't a little girl who was separated. I'd say, of course not. It's just illustrating this. I mean, especially
this isn't a cartoon character.
Well, yeah, of course it's not. I think that was blown out of proportion by the right-wing media.
Well, the fact that the left continues to run with that picture, I think speaks volumes to their integrity. If the idea is that this is so pervasive, they can't find another picture of someone who actually was separated from her family, but they're not going to, because this one pushes more emotional buttons, and it pushes those buttons in the direction that the media wants people to draw the conclusions. Look, if you remember, there was and I don't know if it was Time, I think it was Newsweek, where you had the reporter. This was in a Israeli rocket attack on Gaza. This was several years ago, and there was like a plume of smoke, and to make the picture look a little better, the photographer photoshopped in lots more plumes of smoke.
Yeah.
And again, it's one of these. Well, yeah, it's accurate, and yeah, there was an airstrike, and but it's sort of the one plume of smoke versus the entire city on fire.
They did the same thing with one of them. Did the same thing with the O.J. Simpson thing. They made him look darker and more criminal and all that kind of thing. Yeah,
and you can make the argument that they did that with the John McCain picture. Well, but although even though, I mean, I think there's a difference between, look, we're shading the picture a little bit. That look, this is still a real picture of O.J. Perhaps we're showing it in an unfavorable light, as opposed to, we're photoshopping stuff in, or we're putting someone in to say that this is, sort of a symbol for something that she's not.
Right. Well, I guess I would agree to the extent that certainly you could find a heart-rending picture of a little girl who was separated from her parents that wasn't that little girl.
Yeah. But let's one last thing, because I do want to push back, because this is sort of a big deal for a lot of conservatives, and for me, is, how hard is it for the media, professional media, to simply make the judgment call, we shouldn't use that picture because that's not accurate. Let's go with a different picture.
Right. And I think
the
probably
fact that they haven't is telling.
I think they used it because, of course, the image has gone viral, as they say, and so it's a familiar image, and it's kind of been used as the face of it. So I think it was much more. I understand where on the right you'd say, well, this is an ideological bias thing. I think it's more just of a sort of a marketing sort of decision, and that doesn't make it any less right, but I think it's coming from more of a marketing type of mindset than it is from an ideological bias mindset.
Okay.
All right. Well, there were a whole bunch of other things that happened this week. Like, for instance, gerrymandering. Jay, we spent a lot of time earlier this year talking about gerrymandering. And of course, that's because the Supreme Court had several gerrymandering cases on its docket this term, and we were, I think, both interested in their decision. So just to recap for everyone, the court for a long time now has held that racial gerrymandering, which is constructing congressional districts based on race, may run afoul of the Constitution, but it's never actually ruled that any sort of partisan gerrymandering is unconstitutional.
Right. But to the exception that there is, to some extent, some racial gerrymandering required under the Voting Rights Act.
Exactly. Now, in 1986, there was a case, Davis versus Vandermeer. The court said that partisan gerrymandering could violate the Constitution's Equal Protection Clause, but in order for the court to rule on the constitutionality of it, they said they'd need a clear standard as to, well, kind of how much was too much. And Justice Kennedy said the same thing in 2004 when he said that what he called extreme partisan gerrymandering could be unconstitutional, but a standard was needed. And
which is where your folks jumped in with
a standard that political scientists and social scientists created called the efficiency gap, to quantify this. Now, during oral arguments of these two cases this year, Justice Roberts called this sociological gobbledygook, which was certainly memorable. I think it was ridiculous and simply untrue, but that's another story. Anyway, that brings us to the rulings. One concerning Republican gerrymandering in Wisconsin, and the other on Democratic gerrymandering in Maryland. Now, in both cases, the court decided, well, kind of not to decide, at least not yet. In the Maryland case, they released an unsigned opinion saying that because the case hadn't even gone to trial yet, they wouldn't rule on it. in the Wisconsin case, Chief Justice Roberts wrote for a unanimous court that the plaintiffs in Wisconsin hadn't demonstrated that they'd been individually harmed by the gerrymandering, and so therefore they lacked standing to bring the case. And the data presented in this case focused on the state as a whole, not individual districts. But he added that the plaintiffs should be granted the opportunity to demonstrate individual harm at the lower court level. And this isn't necessarily a hugely difficult hurdle. There are many analysts who don't believe it's going to be that difficult to present the supporting data in a way that focuses on essentially district level impacts, which is more or less what the court suggested they need. Now, there was also a concurring opinion. Justice Kagan, joined by the court's three other liberals, Ginsburg, Sotomayor, and Breyer, they made it pretty clear, I think, that if this case does come back to the Supreme Court, there's a strong possibility there are going to be 4 votes in favor of overturning partisan gerrymanders. So I think that kind of brings us up to date. So Jay, I guess what do you think about these decisions? Are you disappointed that we didn't get any clarity on this issue?
No, first and foremost, I want to, and you can maybe go back and check the show when we talked about this, but I think one of my first issues was I don't see how these people have standing. I think I raised that. I'm just saying.
There you go.
And I agree with the court. I don't get where you have an individual right to standing. How have you been harmed by the fact that voters in some other district in your state elect someone else to the state house or Congress who is not of the party you prefer? So I think the court did it right, both on the merits that there isn't standing, and to the extent that if we're going to have this out and have this fight, let's have the factual record fully developed and knock out any of these other side issues, if you will. I mean, standing isn't necessarily a side issue, but let's have the preliminary issues fully resolved before this goes up.
Yep, and
I think it's good.
I agree entirely with you. While I certainly side more with those who concurred in terms of their thinking about this issue. It's important to point out this was a unanimous decision, which obviously means something. And so I don't have a lot to say except that this is an example of all 9 members of the court deciding not to take sort of a judicially activist stance. And while I am ideologically left of center, I also am ideologically a supporter of judicial restraint. And so therefore, I think this was the right decision by the court. I think this will pretty clearly come up before the court again, if not in the next term, in the term after. And while I would love some clarity on this, we have to wait for this because I don't want the court stepping in before the time is right. So I'm good with this.
Okay. Yeah, me too.
Awesome. All right, I wanted to talk about. We're talking about
not that it particularly matters.
No, exactly.
The Supreme Court, because it's it will happen regardless of our thoughts.
Yeah,
but,
exactly. Mike and Jay agree with us, so that's you brought up.
Roberts is like woo.
You brought up activism and restraint, or at least I did, and so I'd like to talk about the other big Supreme Court case because I think in a weird way that actually speaks to this in a way. And I'm talking about the Supreme Court decision on state sales tax that came down this week. Now, this one wasn't unanimous. It was a 5-4 split.
It was a weird split.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Basically, the court said that states may require online retailers to charge sales tax on out-of-state sales. And this essentially overturns the court's 1992 decision in Quill versus North Dakota, in which the court said that states couldn't impose state sales tax unless the seller had a physical presence in the state. And you're right about that split. The majority decision was written by Justice Kennedy, joined by Justices Thomas, Alito, Gorsuch, and Ginsburg. And Ginsburg's obviously the odd woman out there. And their argument was that technological change had basically made this 1992 ruling obsolete, and that in the current environment, kind of brick and mortar retailers were being unfairly disadvantaged by having to charge sales tax when online competitors didn't, which that like makes a lot of sense. But then there was a dissent, which was written by Chief Justice Roberts, joined by Breyer, Sotomayor, and Kagan. Again, a weird split, which argued basically that things may have changed, but it's Congress's job to change the law in response to this. And that's why I bring up that judicial restraint thing. Yeah, well, the weird thing was here, Jay, is that when I first read, obviously, the majority's argument, because that was the one that was presented first, and I thought, yeah, that totally makes sense. It's a weird split, but I'm kind of with the majority. But then I read the dissent, and I thought about that, and I was like, I like this from a policy standpoint, this outcome. I think it's more fair, but I think John Roberts has it right. And it occurs to me, when you look at Roberts' jurisprudence as the Chief Justice over a period of, he's been on the court for a while now, that's one strain that really seems to come through in a lot of ways, and it's angered both conservatives and liberals. There were the healthcare cases and so forth, but he's been pretty strongly, I think one thing I see in his jurisprudence is a judicial restraint that we sometimes don't see, both from the justices on the left and the justices on the right. And even though ideologically I disagree with him more than I agree with him in terms of policy terms, in terms of the role of the court, I think Justice Roberts is kind of nailing it. Yeah,
no, we're on the same page on this one. And I think there ought to be cause for concern. I have cause for concern anytime a court opinion sort of leads with this produces a good beneficial policy result.
Absolutely.
That's our reasoning, because that's not the reasoning that the court ought to apply. That's the reasoning Congress ought to apply.
Yeah.
And so often in our system, that distinction is lost. That it's important not only what decision is made, it's important who makes the decision and who has the authority to make that decision, and allowing the judiciary to make too many of those too many, almost all, any policy decision is not good for us as a democracy.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, this is a major policy decision. There, one government study indicated that states have missed out on just shy of $14 billion in sales tax due to this. But again, you're absolutely right. It's just saying that this is there's a great magnitude to this in policy terms doesn't mean that the court
Therefore,
should be
it's our job.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So
now, this may well push Congress to do something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I think that would be appropriate. I think there are policy concerns that this raises in terms of who does it benefit. As any type of regulatory thing, it essentially is going to benefit the Amazons, the big guys, as opposed to mom and pop who are running a little Etsy store kind of thing, and don't have the wherewithal to figure out sales tax in every district and locality throughout the country. And if you figure the difficulty of that job, it's not just of, okay, this state has this much of a state sales tax, so we'll tack that on. It's, they're buying it in this county, which also has a sales tax on these items, and it's in this city, which has a tax on certain items. It can be there's something like 10,000 different taxing districts in the United States, and while an Amazon type operator will have the wherewithal to figure that all out, or fight it if appropriate, a smaller, again, mom and pop online operator will not, and the pressure is going to be then that these people sort of sell out to Amazon, get bought out, or buy some sort of tax calculation service from someone like an Amazon. So,
and that's more generally a problem with a lot of one size fits all regulation. Is it tends to disadvantage the smaller companies, also not just coincidentally those that don't tend to have the lobbying power that the big companies have in DC.
Yeah. And again, I'm not saying that regardless that's a good reason to support the dissent, because what I just made were policy arguments, and those are arguments that you ought to make before Congress, not the court.
But and that's another reason why it's better for, I think, in many of these cases, Congress to work these things out as opposed to the court because they have the expertise. They're going to hear the voices, and they are complex things to work out, which is why, as a general rule, the court, even when you could argue that they may be able to step in a policy role, tends not to do as good of a job just because they don't have the resource. That's not what they're set up to do.
Yeah, no, I would say even the bigger point for me is the importance is having Congress decide policy issues is because that's who's elected. To some extent, it's either you want a republic or not. Congress may well reach a result that you don't like or that I don't like. But the fact is, they're still the duly elected representatives to do that, and there's a mechanism to change that down the road, as opposed to just a judicial fiat of judges who we don't elect.
Yeah, because if you don't like what the court does, you just basically have to wait till someone dies and the court changes. Right. So exactly.
It's a good thing we agreed with. Well, it's a good thing we agreed with the first one, but again, you can see where we are on the second. So
absolutely. Before we get to our next story, we'd like to thank our newest supporters. We have this week 3 new monthly sustaining supporters on Patreon, Jesse, Aiden, and Kenneth. So thank all. Yeah. Aiden wrote in, hello, Mike, Jay, and Trey, and Ken. I love listening to civil debate, even if some of the things said can be infuriating. To all the listeners, you should go to Patreon and pledge to Politics Guys. Just give them $1. That's what I did. Well, thank you. Thank you, Aiden. We definitely do appreciate that. And no, we did not write that comment ourselves. That did come from Aiden. Thanks so much. I should point out that in addition to that warm glow you get from helping out, supporters also get access to our exclusive supporters-only Politics Guys after show. On last week's show, Trey and Ken talked about free trade, the digital economy versus the manufacturing economy, the first female African-American mayor in San Francisco's history, Trey's very sweaty running habit. Apparently, Trey runs through headphones like crazy, sweats right through them. I had no idea. And also, they decided to opine on the crazy things that I do in the weight room. So they really covered a lot of ground there. And this week, Jay and I have some pretty interesting stuff lined up for you as well. Also, when you make a pledge of financial support for the show, we'd love to include a message from you in your shout out. So if there's anything you want to pass along, you can include this both in your Patreon contribution, or you can just send us a message at mail@politicsguys.com. So thanks. If you want to join Jesse, Aiden, Kenneth, and all of our really great Politics Guys supporters, just go to politicsguys.com/support. That's a direct link, or politicsguys.com, and you'll see that support thing there, or just click on the Patreon or PayPal links. Thanks so much, guys. All right, moving on. So, government reorganization. That's generally what you think about. Government reorganization. It doesn't make your heart go pitter-patter unless you're someone like me. But if you add in Space Force.
Yeah,
you say it so well.
Can you do like an echo effect?
I don't know. I should try that out.
Figured out how to do that yet.
But anyway, all of a sudden, maybe you have something there. And of course, that's exactly what President Trump did this week, calling for a Space Force to be a new 6th branch of the military and directing the Department of Defense to make it so. Did you get my Star Trek reference there, Jay?
Like that,
yeah. Awesome. There we go. But while the president can do a lot of organizational reshuffling in the executive branch, he can't actually create a new branch of the military all by himself. That requires congressional legislation. Now, that said, the Air Force, which currently handles most defense-related space stuff through its Air Force Space Command, they can be directed to set up a separate staff and command structure, though it will still be under the Department of the Air Force. And by the way, the Department of the Air Force itself was created out of the Army Air Corps after World War II in the 1947 National Security Act. That's the last time we got a new branch of the military. So, Jay, do we need a Space Force?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I don't know that we need one, but no, we need to do something, and I think it's a good step to take. And again, I know it sounds a little silly, and Trump makes it sound a little silly, but look, we are always in competition with other nations, and we won the space race, and we sort of established space as a peaceful place where we will work together and so forth. But that's not necessarily always going to be that way, and I think we need to be prepared for that. Now, again, I'm not saying we need to build a Death Star.
Well, I should point out that we're signatories to something called the Outer Space Treaty. This was signed in 1967, which prohibits weapons testing in space, military bases on other celestial bodies, or putting weapons of mass destruction in orbit around the Earth. And both China and Russia also signed on to this treaty. So Death Stars would be presumably covered by this. But I guess what I was wondering about
that there's also the idea that the Russians and the Chinese would always abide by that.
Sure. Yeah, there's no enforcement mechanism for this thing. But I guess what I was wondering, Jay, is since the Air Force Space Command is already doing this, as a sort of a limited government conservative, isn't this creating a separate agency with separate staff and structures and all that? Isn't that the kind of administrative bloat that you don't like?
Yeah, it typically is. Now there may be something that's different, and look, I'm not going to be the guy to weigh in on to say whether this ought to be a continuing division of the Air Force or something new. But I mean, I guess I'm thinking more just in terms of ought we to be prepared and take steps to should we ever need to defend assets in space or defend the U.S. in space, we ought to do that. Whether the Air Force does it or whether a separate organization does that, again, that's sort of a management question because I can see it from both sides. On the one hand, you don't want bureaucratic bloat with too many additional agencies doing duplicate stuff. And you don't want to have agencies that maybe ought to have overlap, then having turf wars. But by the same at the same time, you don't want to have other agencies like the Air Force get too big, get too non-specialized in other things
sure.
that takes away. So I am not a management guru. So I don't know whether and look, I don't know what there's to opine because we don't really have a real policy proposal other than just Space Force.
Really, you need more than that, right?
We can say, okay, here's what this other organization would do and not do, and here's what the Air Force would continue to do or not do. So no, I think it's always healthy to re-examine where efficiencies can be found in government, and it's important to re-examine places where government might need to do something in the future that we ought to start preparing for.
Yep. I've got
that said, I mean, again, with the lack of specifics, there's not a ton there. So
yeah. But also this week, well, on one hand, so the president
rolling the labor into education. That's something different.
On one hand, so he's saying let's create this new agency, but then he said, well, let's combine two cabinet departments, labor and education, like you said, and the idea apparently is to bring the education department into labor. Education department's a lot smaller. In fact, it's the smallest of the 15 cabinet departments. Also, it's one of the most recent. It was created just in 1979, and the idea, I guess, is to better focus education on vocational skills and labor force development. Now this is another change that would require congressional approval, so I'd say its prospects aren't exactly super strong at this point. But just as a proposal, what do you think about it, Jay?
Again, I think there's something to be. I'll be honest. I think there is also a conservative push. Conservative never, particularly liked, needed, wanted the Department of Education, Federal Department of Education. It was created under the Carter administration, and one of Ronald Reagan's unkept campaign promises was to abolish it. So, I mean, I think a lot of conservatives don't have a whole lot of use for a Federal Department of Education when what they often do is impose standards on states that states don't like. The other big piece of what the department does now as sort of a financing arm for college education and college loans. So there really are sort of two completely separate missions between what the Department of Education does and the Department of Labor does. Again, I think it's fantastic to encourage more vocational programs. I think that's something that we need in our country. We have so many kids who are told that college is the only option, and I don't think that's true. They can make a great living working in a lot of trades, and America needs those skilled laborers. So I'm all for that. Does merging these two departments get there? Yeah, I don't know. Is it a step toward sort of winding down the Department of Education? Well, I don't know.
Yeah.
But
well,
again, there's not enough, to say, aha, this is.
Yeah. No, to me, it's kind of weird, given everything that's going on. Just deciding, let's throw this thing out here that really isn't going to go anywhere. Let's use time and energy, and I don't really get it. I guess in a way, maybe you could make a case for it. Maybe, and I have so many conflicting views on education, in part because of what I do for a living in my day job, apart from where I see the future of higher education, especially higher education, going. But it just seemed like an out of nowhere sort of thing. Well, I guess the Space Force thing was kind of out of nowhere too. So I don't know, but so I don't know how I feel about it. I guess like you, I would need to see something a little more specific to really.
I've got my Space Force music on.
Oh, there we go.
I was trying to get like cool photon torpedo noises to make when we say Space Force.
We could throw some Buck Rogers kind of stuff in there. Yeah. I don't know, but anyway. So anything more on that, Jay?
No, well, and other than, I mean, you say that this is just in part of government. There are a lot of moving pieces, and look, there's one group of bureaucrats who were apparently tasked with this of coming up to what we can do, and here's their report. So I don't necessarily agree with this. Takes away time and energy.
Yeah, maybe right. Yeah,
from
Yeah, I see your point. Yeah.
Look, we're still talking with North Korea. We're still. It's not like we're somehow going to say, "Whoa, hold on." But I agree. This is a back burner issue, and this is one of the things. The way these things work is, it's floated and then it's talked about, and then maybe there's a bill down the line. It probably doesn't go anywhere, and then maybe there's another bill. So this is just one of those. Again, you float the idea and see where it starts going.
Yeah, that seems reasonable. Well, finally this week, not finally as in finally this great thing happened. Sorry, I meant like this is the last story we'll be talking about today. But this week, U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, Nikki Haley, announced that the United States will be pulling out of the UN's Human Rights Council. Now, Haley said that the United States couldn't stay in an organization that was, in her words, a protector of human rights abusers and a cesspool of political bias. I think most people on the right applauded this, saying that it was really kind of high time that the U.S. distance itself, or pull out entirely, obviously, from a group that includes among its current 47 members notorious human rights abusers like China, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia. And they also argued that the council seemed to exist largely to condemn Israel. Jay, I'm betting I know how you feel about this, but why don't you tell me? Did you like this move?
Yeah, you bet right. I absolutely agree. The UN Human Rights Commission is and has been a very bad joke for decades. It is, it's often said sort of the hypocrisy is the tribute that vice pays to virtue, and that's sort of the essence of this is you've had these regimes that are horrible in terms of their human rights records, sort of lecturing the rest of the world and sort of preening that, oh, look, we're on the Human Rights Commission, and it is made a mockery. So I think it is it's good that Nikki Haley is sort of speaking truth to power here. And stepping out. And as far as the anti-Israel bias, I think that's hard to argue. If you look at the track record of the commission and its proclamations, I mean, it's something like 90% or something are aimed at Israel. And there's also what's called on there that's permanent agenda item 7 that at every meeting, they bring up and let me, they start in on Israel. So I think it's good. I think it's good that the U.S. and other Western powers, I think, should follow that example and not lend legitimacy to this. What's really a sham.
Yeah, I understand that viewpoint, and certainly I think there's no question that the the council is biased against Israel, and this coming from me, someone who's
But so are you.
yeah, well, exactly. Well, I had a feeling I walked right into that one.
Yeah.
But also, also that they have just some horrible human rights abusers on it. And just to give people a little background here, this council was created in 2006. It replaced another council. I forget the acronym right now, but
it wasn't so good either.
When it was created, it was designed to have regional representation. So they have 3-year terms, chosen from various geographical regions. The problem is that some of these geographical regions just are basically made up entirely of non-democratic human rights abusers. So what the Bush administration did at the time, this 2006 when it was formed, they boycotted it, saying basically under the same logic as Nikki Haley announced. What President Obama did in 2009, he said, well, this is all true, but let's try to work within the organization to make it less biased. Let's try to engage, essentially. And depending on who you talk to, under the Obama administration, certainly the anti-Israel bias, even though it's clearly still there, went down if you measure it in terms of number of resolutions against Israel there. And so with this
new council, 50% less racist.
Well, but I think this is important, not so much. Well, I think this is important in a broader sense. It really illustrates to me, it's of a piece with kind of the Trump administration's approach to a lot of these things, saying that pretty clearly their approach is not to work within flawed agreements, to make them better, kind of behind the scenes, applying pressure, that sort of thing. That's not the Trump administration MO, for better or for worse. I tend to think that the Obama approach is a lot better, but it's pretty clear that the Trump administration approach is we want the deals that we want, and if we don't get them, we're going to walk away from the table, and we're big enough that our walking away from the table is going to have enough of an impact where we think that's more likely to result in change than our working within the organization. I mean, would you say that's fair?
Well, I would say it's a little different saying that we don't get the deals we want versus we don't want to lend our credibility to this enterprise.
Sure. In this particular case, I'm talking about the broader...
In the sense of like a G7 or NAFTA or something like that, we don't get the deals we want, we'll walk away. Yes, that's very Trumpian. The idea that we should not take part in, essentially sort of dining with dictators and human rights abusers, and pretend that we're not doing that. I think it's a good and healthy thing. I would agree with you that it's not the great way to go, though. My way or the highway when you're talking about international trade agreements. But when you're talking about human rights, I think that there's a better case to be made for the we're going to walk away.
Of course, because people who, that they're making this strong human rights claim and we will not be a party of this sort of thing. And yet, how much did Donald Trump talk about human rights abuses in North Korea when he met with Kim? It didn't seem like a whole lot. So but to be fair, both Republicans and Democrats always tend to have a more than a little bit hypocritical view when it comes to human rights. Now, it's not all Republicans and Democrats, certainly, but, there's certainly a case of, well, we'll put this in kind of as a side issue sort of thing. Some administrations are better or worse. The Carter administration really tried to put human rights, for instance, on toward the top of the agenda, and were criticized greatly for doing that. I think the Obama administration certainly pushed more on this than the Trump administration is willing to do. So it's really kind of a variable sort of thing.
Well, I think the way you and I've thrown this out numerous times. With human rights abusers in other countries in the world, I think you do what you can where you can. And the UN Commission is a place where we can make that sort of statement, and get some good, or at least do no harm, if you follow me.
So I think
look, international politics are complicated, and we some of these human rights abusers are our allies. I mean, notably Egypt, Egypt, Saudi Arabia. And others are, let's put it this way, if not are China, I think, is perhaps an adversary, but it's someone as a country with which we do a lot of business. And there's different approaches and different lengths that one can go. It's a matter of how much power you have in that relationship. And I think in terms of this commission and the U.S.'s visibility on it, I think we do have a fair amount of power to be able to walk away and sort of demand that if this is going to exist, that they do better.
Sure. I see your point. I think it's a good point. I completely disagree with it, but only in the sense that the analysis of we can do more by walking away. That's all in this particular case. But I certainly understand your logic on that. All right. Well, that about does it for this week. Before we go, I want to thank everyone who subscribed to my new interview podcast, Politics Plus, which you can find pretty much anywhere you listen to podcasts or at politicsplus.us. Last week, I talked to Atlantic columnist, former George W. Bush speechwriter David Frum, who actually I had up on the Politics Guys.
I'm a big fan. Yeah, so that's a big deal. Yeah,
he's a great guy, and we talked about his book Trumpocracy. And this week, because shows come out on Monday, I'm going to be talking with conservative writer Mona Charen about her new book, Sex Matters: How Modern Feminism Lost Touch with Science, Love, and Common Sense.
That is also a very big deal.
Yeah, that was a really interesting conversation. It was a book I actually learned some things, was really surprised. So it's a great conversation, I think. What I wanted to point out to everyone, I'd like to think as my first two guests sort of demonstrate that I'm really trying to bring in a wide variety of views. I mean, David Frum, stridently anti-Trump, but he's definitely a conservative. I think Trump is someone that a lot of...
Some would argue definitely was a conservative.
Well, yeah, but he's still policy-wise
he's still
right of center.
More on the right, yes.
And I think a lot of left-of-center listeners would like that interview, but I also think he makes some important points that more conservative people should consider. And by way of contrast, Mona Charen, she's been a big-time conservative columnist for, a long time. You might recall, Jay, she was kind of more or less booed off the stage at CPAC not too long ago for saying that, maybe we shouldn't be supporting Roy Moore and Donald Trump's crude comments about women and that sort of thing. But her book is without a doubt not left-wing feminism. In fact, if you're a left-wing, what she calls modern feminist, you take issue with it. But I learned a lot from that. And that's what really I'm trying to do, is bring in people from the left and the right, because, I feel like so many interview podcasts I listen to, and I listen to a lot, tend to be a lot of that kind of preaching to the choir. Libertarians bring on libertarians, conservatives bring on conservatives. And honestly, I don't learn a lot from that, which is why I wanted to really do this. And so, I hope people want that and will appreciate that. So anyway, like I said, it's at politicsplus.us or wherever you get your podcast apps pretty much. And if you want to let me know what you think about it, you can reach me at mike@politicsplus.us, or you can reach me through the Politics Guys email too. That'll work as well. So anyway, in just a few minutes, Jay and I will be recording our supporters exclusive after show. And I think one thing I know I want to bring up is the death of conservative columnist Charles Krauthammer and Canada becoming the second country in the world to legalize marijuana, and maybe whether the U.S. should do that. And I think there are a couple other things we'll want to get to. I'm sure you have something for us, Jay. So if you are interested in checking that out, if you're a supporter, it should be already in your podcast, the feed. by the time you hear this. And if you aren't a supporter and you want to listen to that, you want to check it out, just go to politicsguys.com/support. That's a direct link. Or you can go to politicsguys.com and click on the Patreon or PayPal links or support the show. And also, of course, you get that warm glow for knowing you're helping us out. So that's it for this episode. Thanks, everyone, for listening. We do hope you like what you heard. Also, subscribing to the show really helps us, as does sharing episodes. Word of mouth, really the best advertising. Leaving reviews and ratings of the show on iTunes is also a big deal for us. And again, if you want to get in touch, mail@politicsguys.com. There's our Facebook page where we've had a lot of great conversations this week, especially on the immigration issue. That's facebook.com/politicsguys page. We're also on Twitter @politicsguys. The executive producers of the Politics Guys are Michael Baranowski, Jay Carson, Trey Orndorff, and Bruce Johnson. Today's show was produced by Michael Baranowski. We'll be back with a new show on Wednesday. We hope you'll join us.